Yeah.
One more, Bart, and then we'll hope people will go sign up for your new course and all the courses that you have. But your Paul and Jesus is the latest. Due to similarities between Matthew and Luke, scholars have posited the existence of a lost sayings collection called Q, that the authors of both Gospels had access to and copied from. However, some scholars have argued these similarities can be explained if it is assumed Luke had access to both Mark and Matthew. Which position do you hold and why?
So the first position is called the four-document hypothesis. And it holds that Matthew, Mark, and Luke have four written sources behind them. Mark was the first. Matthew and Luke both used Mark. And so that's why many times Mark's wording, his stories, the sequence of his stories, word for word the same in places in both Matthew and Luke. It's because they were both copying him and sometimes changing one thing or another thing. But they're getting their Mark and stories from Mark. But they have a number of sayings that are not found in Mark, like the Beatitudes or the Lord's Prayer, etc. The idea is that they got them from the source that no longer exists, a source that contained mainly sayings of Jesus, the scholars have called Q. Q is short for the German word Quelle, because German scholars developed this view. The word Quelle in German just means source. This is the sayings source for Matthew and Luke. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke you got Mark, you got Q, Matthew has a bunch of stories himself, that's M. Luke has a bunch of stories himself, that's L. So you got Mark, Q, M, and L. That makes up the three synoptics. Okay, that's the theory. That has been the dominant theory since the middle of the 19th century. There have been alternative theories, including many before that and many after, and one that is catching hold now, especially because of my friend Mark Goodacre, with whom I completely disagree. Mark follows the Farrer hypothesis, which was taught by Farrer had a student who was Mark Goodacre's teacher, and so it kind of is that lineage. Mark holds this Farrer hypothesis. The Farrer hypothesis is that Mark was first, Matthew and Luke both used Mark, but that Luke used both Matthew and Mark. So that's why you have similarities. That's why Matthew and Luke have a number of things in common that aren't in Mark, because Matthew put them in his gospel and Luke copied them from Matthew. So that's the theory. The virtue of that theory is a very strong virtue that cannot be taken lightly. It's that it eliminates a hypothetical source.
Right.
And so Occam's razor would say, get rid of the hypothetical source. And it's absolutely right. If you can get rid of a hypothetical source without creating bigger problems, baby, go that way. Some of these solutions, this is called solutions to this problem. This is called the synoptic problem. How do you explain the relationships, the similarities and the differences among Matthew, Mark, and Luke? How do you do it? And some hypotheses are just crazily complicated. That you've got this source, this hypothetical source is copied, that hypothetical is copied, that source, and then it came down to this, and you have these diagrams like, oh my God. And so you want to get rid of as many hypothetical sources as you can. The problem is that if you get rid of Q, you create huge problems that cannot, in my opinion, be solved very readily. It's a probability case, and so you have to judge which is more probable. But my view is that there are really good reasons for thinking that Luke did not use Matthew. If you want some kind of obvious ones to begin with, they both have birth narratives and genealogies. Look at their birth narratives and genealogies. Does it look to you like Luke got them from Matthew? They're all different. I mean, they have Jesus born of a virgin in Bethlehem, okay, and he's got a genealogy. That's nice. Look at them. They didn't even get them from Matthew. You got them from somewhere else, okay? So there's a lot of places where you have overlap where it's clear Luke's not getting it from Matthew, but there are bigger problems. One very big problem is that Matthew and Luke often have the same sequence of their stories. This happened, then this happened, then this happened, then this happened. Matthew and Luke have that same sequence. That's always in stories found in Mark. Almost always. Not completely, but almost always those are the stories you got in Mark. That would make sense. They're both copying Mark, and they have different places for their, they have different, they're following his outline. Okay, so that makes sense. The problem is when you have these sayings materials that are not in Mark, the sequences are different. So the Lord's Prayer comes at a different place in Matthew than in Luke. The Beatitudes come in a different place from Luke. This parable here occurs here in Matthew, but there in Luke. And so to imagine that happening, it doesn't always happen, but that's the regular pattern, except in places where you can explain it. The sayings of Jesus in Matthew and Luke about in the temptation, man shall not live by bread alone. Those are in the same places in Matthew and Luke, even though that saying's not in Mark. But they're in the same place because Mark has the temptation narrative. He has a shorter version of it, and they're including the sayings in the temptation version. That's what sayings during his temptation. So you can explain a lot of these similarities. But if Luke copied Matthew, why did he take just the things that are not in Mark to rearrange their sequence? Why did he do that? And how did he do it? So I think what we often imagine is that somebody has a big desk in front of him, and he's got 3 books in front of him. And these are books with written on both sides of the page. You open up like our books. And what Luke's doing is he's copying Mark from his book. He cuts and then he's copying Matthew. He says, "Oh yeah." So if he's doing that way, then he's reading Mark and he's reading Matthew at the same time. And they both have that story. Okay, I'm going to put that in the same place. Okay, same story. I'll put that one in the same. Then he comes across something Matthew. Oh, that's not Mark. Oh, I'm going to put that somewhere else. Why? I mean, why does the Sermon on the Mount all of a sudden become all over the place in Luke? I mean, why? But not only why, but how. Ancient scribes appear not to have desks. They wrote on their knees. How do you do that when you're copying 2 books at once? I really don't know.